Hello, and welcome to this week's lecture. As I was prepping for this lecture, I was trying to think of a good title, a catchy title for this week's lecture, and I kind of came up with the idea that today we're going to talk about masculinity, misogyny, and murder. So anytime you can use alliteration, it makes for a good title. So that's what it is. Masculinity, misogyny, and murder is going to be the topic for this week, and let's get right into it. First of all, despite the fact that we're talking about masculinity and murder and the misogyny that goes with that, just hold out hope for another chapter. We may be talking about men this week, but there's another chapter that talks all about the women who commit multi-sides and the female offenders. So we're not going to have a one-sided class by any means, but this week we're talking about men. So men get their turn now. Let's just talk about it, dive right into the idea of this correlation between masculinity and multi-sides, or not just multi-sides that are connected with masculinity, criminality in general, but obviously this class is a serial killer and a mass murder class. So we're going to talk about those types of criminality specifically, and the idea that not just masculinity but hypermasculinity has that correlation between those characteristics and that ultimate criminalistic result of multi-side. What is that? What is that correlation, and what are those characteristics? We're going to talk about that this week. One of the things that really sticks out, one of the statistics that really sticks out when we talk about masculinity, hypermasculinity, and criminality is the idea of the military, veterans, military service. I think that's a very good stereotypical idea. Society looks at military members as a typically male-dominated force. Obviously, societal changes and societies change, but the idea of stereotypically speaking, the military is still to this day looked at by society as a male dominated workplace. So if we look at society as a whole, veterans make up just a touch over 6% of the US population, between 6.5. If we look at those involved in multi-side, which again is serial killers, mass murderers, and spree killers, if 6% of the US society is made up of veterans, those multi-side suspects, 25% of those offenders are made up of veterans. So about 4 times as high of a sample size in the offender category than in the US population. So that says something. That's a significant correlation between veterans and multi-side suspects. What's going on there? We need to talk about that. Let's talk about kind of our definitions. Again, stereotypically speaking, how society looks at what masculinity looks like. Let's define not just masculinity, but this idea of hypermasculinity. As your book talks about, that idea, the connection of hypermasculinity and criminality and murder. We're going to use the term, kind of get away from that hypermasculine term and use a more scientific term. And that scientific term is going to be hegemonic masculinity, or hegemony. The idea of there are just certain types of characteristics in men that society looks at as the typical man, the stereotypical man. And as we go into that conversation, the more attractive of men. And as we talk about this now, I'm sure there's already an image in your head as you think, like, what is an attractive man? What characteristics do attractive men have? Muscular men, decisive men, strong leaders, those who are risk takers, those who have strong opinions, specifically political opinions. So all those characteristics combined together make this hegemonic masculine trait, and that by no means should you take this talk to mean that all men who have these hegemonic traits, these hegemonic characteristics of masculinity, are going to be criminalistic. But that's the stepping off point, where we start looking at where the correlation begins between masculinity and criminality. Because those are also the vast majority of men who possess those traits, those characteristics, are going to end up being successful members of society that are not criminalistic, not engaging in criminality, especially not engaging in murder. However, if you look at the population of those who do engage in multi-side offenses and murder specifically, there is going to be a large percentage of those offenders who possess the traits we just talked about. So again, just because a man possesses those traits doesn't mean they are going to be a murderer, but those who do murder oftentimes have those traits. So that's where we separate that. But as we kind of transition those traits, those hegemonic, those positive, I mean, those are the traits I listed. Muscular, decisive, risk taker, strong opinions. Those are positive traits. So as we transition from that positivity to negativity, we could kind of call this this part of the talk, everything in moderation. If you have a moderate amount of those traits, that's great. That is how people become successful, and in this case, how men become successful, possessing those traits. However, as you start taking that to the extreme, the outliers, then we start seeing things like men who want to subjugate women, men who engage in domestic violence, and then ultimately even strengthening that criminality, taking it deeper into the criminal element, and ultimately committing murderous offenses. That's where we transition from this hegemonic masculinity, and this other term has been thrown around a lot in society and in social media, but this is a more accepted, definitionally accurate term of toxic masculinity. As hegemony transitions to toxicity, we see criminality. So subjugating women was one of the first things I talked about, and that's the idea of just wanting to control women. So you see a huge correlation, or a very significant correlation among homicide offenders, multi-side homicide offenders, and this idea of toxic masculinity wanting to control women. Again, not every man who engages in toxic masculinity will ultimately become a murderous offender. But those who do choose to become murderous offenders oftentimes have those characteristics. So even though we've heard that term toxic masculinity thrown around a lot, I wanted to give you a more academically accepted definition of toxicity as it applies to masculinity. The idea of controlling women, gender roles have become a very, very significant part of the relationship, and not just agreed upon gender roles, but male dominated gender roles, the man making the decisions in that relationship, kind of like in our last talk where we talked about that we've got to have a dominant member of the partnership and a more subservient member of the partnership. In this case, it's a forced dominance, and specifically male female. So you can kind of see, I know in a week or two ago, we talked about the idea of there being this connection, this correlation between losing one's job and engaging in criminality, specifically multi-side. The idea, one of the things that came up was there were several shootings in the 80s that involved postal workers losing their jobs, and the idea that Ted Bundy had admitted he never began to think about engaging in homicide, or in this case multi-side, until he ended up getting laid off. And so when somebody defines their entire relationship as a mandated stereotypical gender role relationship, when that significant aspect of the relationship is taken away, then there is a psychological break. But that, all that being said, we talked about hegemonic masculinity, and the idea that there is a good percentage of multi-side suspects that can be identified as possessing those traits. The opposite is also true. The polar opposite is also true. Another term that has come into prominence when discussing specifically mass murders, but not so much serial killers, but mass and spree killers, has been the term incel, which is short for involuntary celibate. There are just men in this country who don't possess those characteristics we talked about. If we say that being muscular, being decisive, being a risk taker, and having strong opinions, and being able to be charismatic when talking to others if all of those are attractive features, then the opposite has to be true. If one doesn't possess those features, then they are going to be stereotypically unattractive. And if one is unattractive and unable to secure a relational mate, engage in a relationship with those with whom they would like to engage in a relationship, then they are celibate and involuntarily celibate. That's going to come with some animosity. Uh, the thing is about incels, involuntary celibates, is they still adhere to those stereotypically attractive, uh, the mindset that those characteristics are stereotypically attractive. So incels in general, you'll see, still believe that being muscular is an attractive feature, and then they realize they are not. They still realize that being charismatic is an attractive feature, but they also realize that they don't possess that characteristic. So they realize what is attractive, and they still have that mindset of what is attractive, but are well aware that they don't possess those traits. They don't possess those characteristics, those aspects. And in doing so, feel an absolute sense of being wronged. There's a sense of entitlement that they should be able to secure relationships and they're unable to, which causes resentment. And again, not everybody who isn't charismatic or is not muscular is going to engage in criminality or even ultimately homicide. However, there is a category of multi-side offenders who possess all these descriptors, all these characteristics of incels, because as we've seen from studies and investigations from uh, mass shootings and spree killings that involved incel offenders, they begin to you've seen several of them that have left videos, manifesto type videos that have said exactly why they're doing this. They're doing it because they blame women. They blame women for not being attracted to them. They blame women for being shallow and not finding what they possess attractive, despite the fact that they agree on what is stereotypically attractive in society. Society has determined what is attractive, whether it be for men or for women, physically and personality wise. But not only do these incel offenders blame women for being shallow and unattractive to the offender, but they also blame men for possessing the characteristics that they agree upon as being attractive. So there's a lot of that, as I mentioned before, a lot of that animosity, that anger, that resentment, that feeling of being wronged, and then that culminates with some psychological break, and ultimately, those who do uh, choose to take the murderous path end up being multi-site offenders. So the idea that a again, I really want to stress this point. Not every hyper masculine male or hegemonic masculine male is going to engage in criminality, but those that do engage in criminality, there's a significant portion of them who could be categorized as hegemonic. And then same thing with incels. Not every person who is unable to secure a relationship or is unsuccessful in finding relationships, not every one of them is going to decide to be murderous. However, of the population that decides to be murderous, there's a significant percentage of them that would be categorized as incels. So, two polar opposite rationale for engaging in criminality, but interesting how they intertwine in they possessing these hypermasculine traits or failing to possess these hypermasculine traits. Both can be found in the population of multi-site suspects. So, with that being said, I will let you guys get to this week's assignment. Don't forget to take care of the discussion board and follow the prompts. And I look forward to reading them. I will talk to you guys soon.